that different stuff. Let's see. Annual investment always is at least as large or higher than in traditional capitalist institutions. They're not just like taking it off the top. They're investing it back in the company at least the same or higher levels. There's two main critiques among economists that they worry about with democratic cooperatives. One is, and so these are both addressing why are they not more prevalent, if they're more productive, these kinds of things. One of them is underinvestment or self-extinction, which is the idea that members are going to sell off their collectively owned shares for short-term profit. So the solutions that some of them have put in place to stop that from happening that can deal with that problem is to make only that part of the capital is owned individually with limits on returns, and the rest is owned collectively in something they can't take from. So it's seen of as if the business itself is kind of a public good. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's like you can't cannibalize it. It's something that's going to be there. You get small amounts that you can take out of it individually, but no one can just sell off the whole thing itself. And then the other thing is degeneration into capitalist firm. So there have been some examples where what they're going to do is have an increasing percentage of their employees are non-members. So they're hiring people who don't have the democratic rights within the institution. There's the group that does, and then they're hiring temporary employees that don't. And so another concern is, over time, they're going to hire more and more people as non-members until eventually you have a small group at the top who controls it, and it's essentially a capitalist institution again. So ideas that, again, some have put into place to stop this is things like limiting how many non-members you can have, or creating something where, you can have non-members, but after 6 months of employment, they receive membership. And something where, for the first 6 months, they're paying part of their income into it as like a due. So almost like a combining of union and business into one entity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That kind of idea.
I mean, that's generally the idea of co-ops.
Yeah, yeah. The statistics are showing that there's no productivity problem. There's no long-term investment problem. The real problem is them getting a foothold within a capitalist environment. And so I think
you make a jump there, because that's not necessarily a problem. It could be that the way that they're doing now is good, and they just need to grow slowly from their current base and prove that the model works.
Maybe so.
It's not that we need to say that they're oppressed somehow, and we've got to do all this stuff to help grow this model that we don't. We have evidence that in its current state, it works fine. We have no evidence that if we try to blow it up, that it's going to keep those same statistics.
Sorry, I was just going to say that is kind of the thing, though, with crony capitalism, that it does inherently
I'm not defending crony capitalism. Just because I'm saying one system is wrong doesn't mean I'm advocating that our current system is wrong.
No, I understand. I'm just saying that in this system that we currently have, it's difficult to implement different systems because that's kind of a core principle of crony capitalism, is that they sort of muscle out other styles.
And so the argument in the realm of crony capitalism is that you have to provide supports and subsidies to get it on its own feet, and then allow it to compete. And if it fails, it fails. But there's no way for it to get that foothold in that kind of
large scale, and I'd rather see it work more on the small scale. See what I'm saying? Like crony capitalism.
Well, at what level of the small scale is it big enough to validate you wanting to give it a foothold?
I just want to see more than like a grocery store in my local city.
There's hundreds of thousands of them across the world.
I know. I just.
At what level would it then be okay to move it up to the next level to you?
Again, to me, it's just.
Or is this just kind of like a general skepticism?
One of the ideas.
I need evidence. You have all these I really think it would work.
Well, he was also citing some studies that have been done about it.
Right, but they're not. It's that idea though that you're taking the thing earlier with the waters rising, right, from North Carolina. We can't just look at the historical data of water rising to predict what the hell's going to happen, because there's too many other factors involved. It's a way bigger scale than just look at this little data point that it happened to do this at. Right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying I hate every part of libertarian. I lean towards left libertarian ideas myself. Right. Okay? I'm not I don't know, like I said, I have a strange, I don't follow any, I think it's wrong to align yourself with an ideology, personally, because it puts you into a dogmatic thinking.
See, that's the thing, is I didn't really get these ideas from a particular ideology. Chomsky talks a little about this, and I agree with him on a lot of his political points.
He's the major figure of this ideology.
Well, yeah, but that's the thing, is I didn't even get this idea from Chomsky. He actually talks about it very little. He talks about it some, just kind of the general idea of workers controlling their own workplace. But I mean, this ideology, this idea of democratic cooperatives, I got mainly from a combination of like thinking about how do you institute a real institutional form of democratic activity within the society, thinking of like Cicero, that thing. And then the economist, my favorite economist, Richard Wolff, talks a lot about this, the idea of democratic cooperatives, and it's part of this group called Democracy at Work that's all about kind of like shedding light on any research on this and advocating for it as, you know, we should create a democratic sector in the economy to see if it works better or not, that kind of thing.
One of the issues too I have with a lot of economic models is that they're very based on the past and particularly 20th century ideas of the economy. None of these things have any idea how to account for AI.
That was actually
That's
something
very true.
I was gonna bring up.
And so, like, what I want to say again, just to be very clear, because like there may be other ideologies I'll criticize. I don't want you to think that just because I'm criticizing socialism that I hate it. I do think, though, that we need to examine every ideology with the most critical lens, and in particular, not try to implement things without the best evidence we can get. Because, again, particularly with economic systems, we've seen all over the world, when people try to make radical changes without strong evidence, and that's why, you know, we don't need to just have this at the, like, people like Chomsky who aren't economists talking about this. I want to see it mainstream economists start, and there are some economists.
I mean, Richard Wolff has PhD in economics and history from Harvard, Stanford, and Yale.
I'm not saying that there's not good people that are doing stuff like this. So I'm saying, though, the mainstream, the whole...
But the mainstream itself is based in a bubble. I mean, you absolutely cleanse the education in economics of any doubt of capitalism.
Fringe idea that you think is the best. Like, I mean, people make the same argument for communism or anarcho-communism and anarcho-capitalism and every other utopian system that you can put on paper and say, look at all these facts. This is clearly going to work. And if you say that it didn't work here, it's because they just didn't do it quite right, and you didn't think of this one thing that's like the essential feature of it. And once you do it this way, it's fine.
See, but this isn't even a utopian. It's still a market. It's still businesses, just like we have now. It's simply a difference in
nothing to do with markets. Austrian economics is a purely free market system that is utopian. That is not to say that communism is associated.
But this isn't even something that's like a radically outside the box thing compared to what we have now. You're just literally changing the power structure within the business. It's a radical change in terms of that power.
You said the term earlier that you thought we needed radical.
No. I mean, it's not like you're completely throwing out the system we have and having a totally new one. You're changing the power relation within the institutions that already exist.
Right, but
so it's not like going from capitalism to communism.
Though. That's literally what communism is the change of power systems. You take the power.
But it's not from within the institution. You're taking government, which is its own separate institution, and giving it power over things.
Communists would argue that the correct version of communism does not use.
I know, but I'm talking about communism as it actually manifested in the real world.
Right. Which is what I'm saying is the difference between your ideology too. Is that communism has this cool version that you can say is going to work, and then when you put it in the world, it doesn't work. And that's what I'm afraid is going to happen if we try to large-scale implement libertarian socialism, is that when we actually put it into practice, there's pieces, just like communism, that the communists didn't think of, that is going to cause disruption, that could cause things like the collapse of Venezuela. Maybe not to the same degree, because obviously Venezuela didn't even go communist. They had a... too rapid, but still a stepwise transition to socialism. It's not even like they rapidly changed. They tried something.
They still have a lot of capitalist businesses and stuff, but...
Well, yes, but they also are collapsing because they have control of everything.
Well, a huge part of that was that their whole economy was based off oil, and then oil prices tanked.
And they seized the oil.
Yeah,
and then the oil prices.
They nationalized.
And then they started nationalizing more industries as a way to compensate.
But I'm not arguing for any form of nationalization of any kind.
I know that. My point is not
totally
that.
Different.
My point is that just because you think that this thing works on paper really well, billions of people through history have thought that. Much more brilliant people in this room have thought of it.
You can make that argument in general about any alternative system.
Yes, I am making that argument about any alternative system. That's why I'm saying we have to have data, research, and evidence before we move forward.
Yeah, but you can't do that until you give it some kind of realistic foothold in the economy.
To a degree, but I would say there is some.
And that's all I'm arguing for.
Okay, but like... That's fine. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying be careful as to like not have a system where every time a business sells, everybody can turn it into a co-op. Like
why not?
Because that's too extreme. That means that like the people
where would be a good level in your point of view to give this a foothold
something
in
more
the
like on the
economy?
universal income, where we say, okay, well, let's have one little state fund a project in like one city where we like do one business or something like. You don't have to do a massive scale.
Are you talking about a big business? Because there's lots of little businesses already like this,
I'm just
and
saying
we show that
start
they
at
do
a
work.
smaller scale with the experiment. Don't start with like a country in the European Union.
Well,
the whole country.
Well, it's
implements
not
this
in the
one
European
day.
Union.
Or which country was it again?
Britain.
Has Brexit even gone through all the way yet?
It's still in the works.
Yeah, I think technically they are still, but either way, your point's valid.
Well, the other thing that is a problem with that, though, is that one of your criticisms of this is that it doesn't scale well. And so if you try little
but you can't
experiments...
just try to scale it and hope it works.
Well, I understand that, but it's also like, how do you study...
Stepwise.
How do you study how well it scales if you're not willing to let it scale at all? You know, you're trying to advocate for a small
Okay,
implementation
so
of
let's
it.
talk about how empirical data is collected in studies, right? We have to have it controlled so we can say, okay, let's try different companies, have a control company. These two companies are competing in the same industry.
Right.
Let's see what happens when we do this model versus this model. We need control data, not just we changed everything, let's see if it collapsed or not.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's what I'm advocating for, is a really scientific approach about this.
I think there's a really logical way to go about it, and I appreciate that. And I would very much advocate for at whatever level is seen as slow enough for us to create a sector where these exist in the economy, to give them enough of a foothold where they're at a competitive level in an economy that we've all acknowledged is fairly rigged already. So that's a difficult question. At what level, are they in a strong enough position where they can compete in the economy that actually exists? And that's why I'm more in favor of this kind of scaling up. I know it's ambitious and risky, but I mean, it's not like you're giving authoritarian institutions control over businesses. Worst case scenario is these businesses fail. And if the business was already going to go to China, it's not like
assuming it's going to work like it is on paper. It's possible that like the
I'm just saying I want to try.
I'm saying I want to try too.
Yeah.
I want to try slowly and carefully, not let's just run forward and hope it works.
This would be a philosophical difference, because I do see, just in terms of whether it's, what's AI going to look like in the hands of, an economic system and the power distribution that currently exists, or with climate change coming up, I do tend to be more in favor of more radical solutions given the existential threats coming towards us.
Right, but
So,
you have to be careful not to create a further existential threat.
That's true, but I think really, if you're talking about giving workers control of their own businesses, the worst thing that can really happen is the business fails. You're not going to have...
That's pretty bad, though, if it
that's
happens
bad.
on a large scale.
Don't get me wrong.
The Great Depression and stuff.
Don't get me wrong. That's bad. And so you want to talk about, what sectors of the economy is this safe to try in?
That's a good one, too. Yeah,
And
exactly.
what size of businesses?
Exactly.
But this is very different. It's a totally different animal than saying, let's give governments control of businesses. Because now you're risking tyranny.
Yeah, I agree completely. We're on the same page.
Yeah. So I'm less stressed about more rapidly scaling this up, because I think it has less risks involved than something like government control. That scares the shit out of me. I don't want anything to do with that.
Okay, yeah, we're on the same page there. 100%.
Okay. Yeah.
I think just to clarify some of those things, like the biggest debate I see between the two of you here is that you like a speed and size of implementation.
Right.
And so,
which, when you really get down to it, is a pretty good place to be at.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think that you have a valid point about there needing to be some study at least, or like a lot of thought put into what size and speed and locations
and what types of businesses
are actually valid, because like you say, it's hard to control for all these variables in a system that we have right now. And so like it's very important that we're thinking about that, and we don't want to scale it up to the point where like an extreme failure could cause cascading problems in the economy, which I'm assuming is one of the biggest things you're worried about. But obviously you can't say, like, you can't run an experiment where you're not controlling for those variables either, and then assume that it's representative of how it could function. If you put them as a small business, for instance, like say some business that wants to compete with YouTube comes up and they're like, well, let's try a democratic co-op there. And it's like, okay, well, if they're 100,000 people even trying to compete with YouTube, like as a startup, they're going to fail. It doesn't matter who runs it, right? And so,
YouTube's almost a monopoly.
Exactly.
And I would support if the government or something wanted to attempt like a single experiment like that and say, we're going to give a subsidy to this company to try that. I'd be totally on board with a one-off or like a very well thought out
Yeah.
series of experiments in
Yes.
particular. That's what I want to see, and not just a blanket policy that's
And,
like, let's
you know,
push this down your throat.
I think that's an interesting question, or an interesting thing to talk about in general. Is we should be doing that kind of thing with multiple systems. We should
Yeah,
be trying
definitely,
different things
definitely.
and seeing can these things work. And one thing that's interesting about economic research today is that we can do that type of thing in microeconomies that are created in video games.
Totally.
So, like EVE Online has a ton of professional economists studying it and also managing it, which I think is really crazy and awesome. And
It's really
interesting.
cool.
And
Yeah.
so I think funding research that works like that, and then trying to take what we learned from those things and implement them in the real economy in the ways that you're talking about, I think is a really great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's tons of game economies that are like that. That like people legit like you can if you're in business school you could write a paper on a game economy.
That's so
That's
cool.
a legit thing. Because they're massive.
I
You
feel
look
like-
at, games like WoW and stuff.
Oh,
too,
yeah.
just like
I feel like the kinds of AI simulation things we're going to be able to run when AI gets better to test things that don't have to exist in the real world is going to get so much more sophisticated. It's going to be a trip.
oh for sure, yeah.
But just some other kind of ancillary benefits in terms of the theory. So I mean, there's certainly issues in terms of where and how fast to implement.
Right.
Totally. In terms of the broader benefits in the hypothetical case that this succeeds. So I mean, there's that political problem, which is that you're more capable of having a democratic political system if you have a reciprocal relationship with the economic system. If you have a democratic economy, people not only have a democratic foundation of community members where they're interacting democratically amongst themselves on which to ground their democratic activism, they're getting all the training, the education, and how to organize in that way, how to think in that way, and interact in that way. And then on top of that, you have a lot of the big problems of capitalism that this could potentially deal with. So the inequality, things like passing that initiative. Almost all democratic cooperatives pass something like that thing Mondragon has, where they make that income gap.
Right. That's really
Cap.
important. That's probably the coolest part to me.
Exactly. And then things like, environmental degradation. People are far less likely to choose within their business to destroy the environment or pollute the environment around them if they're the people that live in this environment. You've got all these chemical companies in Louisiana and stuff that just destroy the bayous and all these places, and the workers feel shitty about it, but they need the work.
Right.
And you're not going to have a business that sells off and moves to China. If the workers have to vote, do you think we should lose our jobs and move the business to China? They're going to vote no. So, I mean, some of our biggest problems right now, inequality, deindustrialization, and climate change, this has huge positive implications to deal with a lot of the problems we face, and the lack of political sovereignty.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of big potentialities.
I'm curious as to your take on the education system in relation to that.
So this
how
is
would you
actually-
think that would what would you do to the education system?
Okay.
to foster those
So this is
democratic-
actually...
Before we go to that, I wanted to see, did you have anything that you wanted to add to
Yeah,
the
get in there,
conversation
Drewby.
about the democratic co-ops?
I'm stoked to talk about that, though, because actually thinking about democratic education, I thought of before I got into economics, because I started off from an interest in Athens and Rome and education in terms of my history interest. So that's actually what led me down this, is how do we get an education system
Okay.
that is democratic in nature? But anyway, go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, I mean, I do. Once Dan did bring up the idea of you have to be able to teach people for the economic system that we would be working in, and since it is democratic, the co-ops would be democratic. It does seem really cool that to imagine people who they go to work and think this way, and then they go out and then they're chatting with their friends, and then they talk about politics, and they know every single little trick that you have to pull. Are you thinking about this? Are you thinking about this? Kind of it also improves scientific thinking, I think, rational and critical thinking, just because that I feel is necessary in democracy if you really want your business to continue.
It should be necessary.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if you want your
it's an actual necessary.
well, if you want your business to continue, I feel it has to.
I think it's
Right,
necessary for a democracy to actually flourish. I think
Right.
that's
That's
Yes,
right, exactly.
yes. It's kind of like an institutional prerequisite to a good functioning one.
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, that's part of the problem is we have an education system meant to facilitate an authoritarian economic system, which kind of cripples our capacity as democratic citizens in a political system, So my idea of an education system, and I'm by no means an expert on how this would go. I mean, we'd need research on, what education systems work best to facilitate all this. But I mean, I would draw a lot of inspiration from the thoughts in ancient Athens, talking about how you don't educate people based off just giving them knowledge and memorization of facts. you give them the capacities to learn for themselves, to question things like, teaching them big topics like logic, ethics, rhetoric, physics, the kind of like the core things that make you a functioning, liberated individual. And I think that is very in line with American values as well.
Right.
And kind of the aspirations of America and what that kind of individual liberty is supposed to be.
Yeah.
The whole Western tradition. And so I think there's a lot of potential there to really liberate the individual and the human experience, as well as create a better world for, that we live in. So I think education would be based a lot less on memorization, a lot more on building up the characteristics of the individual, a lot more on debate and collective action, and to question things and individual sovereignty and just all of that.
We're 100% on the same page.
Yeah, and that's where I started off, because I was starting off going, why is our education system not making us that way?
Yeah.
And go, oh, well, business interests really affect how our education system works in each era to create the kind of workers they want.
Right.
And so now it becomes an economic problem and a political problem. And that's really how my line of thinking got to democratic cooperatives, was starting off with, why aren't we educated like the Athenians? Why aren't we all these things we claim we're supposed to be? So that's really the roots of where I'm at.
One of the things that also comes to mind when, for studies, because now I'm thinking about different kind of researching for Mondragon and other co-ops like that, is I would be really interested to see how depression and anxiety is compared to the rest of the population in Spain for Mondragon, because I would like to see, obviously you'd have to correlate it with IQ and stuff like that, but the interesting thing to me is that I feel like a lot of people are either depressed or anxious about things that they can't do anything about now. There's a lot of existential that may not even be existential to the point of all of humanity, but individually existential.
Dread.
Yeah, exactly. That they feel like they can't do anything to help their country, basically. It's they don't, or at least they don't know. So what they do is, again, they simplify, make it so that they're day to day, right, rather than long trajectory kind of stuff. And if you did have an outlet where at work you knew that you had that, you knew that, yeah, maybe, okay, I don't get to decide what the big policies are in America, maybe I don't get to choose if my if the army goes to war or whatever, it's then at least you get to have that outlet at work. And I would be interested if that declines the kind of anxiety and depression that comes along with it.
This led me to one other kind of question regarding that. I wonder if you've seen any criticism in this area as far as because I did mention sort of it divulging into a capitalist thing, but I'm thinking it's almost like every company would be a mini government.
Yeah,
exactly.
sort of a small, and that's one of the really interesting things is we know democracy works best on small scale.
Right, but what I'm wondering is, what if one company got too big with that model and scaled and essentially became a corrupt government?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Interesting.
I don't really have, I haven't put enough thought into that to have a good answer. I still think overall the economy would be far less corrupt than the one we have now, even if there are examples of that.
Awesome.
Because, at least there's that accountability to your employees.
Especially if they got another layer of oversight between the actual government.
Right, exactly. And a tyrannical company is not as dangerous as a tyrannical government. We have tyrannical companies already, too. Don't get me wrong, I think those are dangerous.
Check out that Harari talk after this, because he mentions in that, because at the end they asked the dude, I can't remember his name, the TED guy, he asked him a couple questions. He's like, so, you talk about how companies have the data and stuff. Shouldn't we be more worried about governments concentrating our data because they're harder to overthrow? And he was like, no. He was like, whoever has the data is your real government. It doesn't matter if whatever company has it.
I agree completely. Yeah, so yes.
Also the idea that companies can literally be in how many different countries at one time?
Yeah,
they get to affect as many politics as they want.
Still, I would much prefer a business that's at least democratically accountable to its own employees to have my data than a company that just has a board of directors and CEOs.
No, I would say
there's at least a layer of accountability.
Very difficult to get to that level with this, just because of the individual resilience of every single person.
We would hope, at least.
Yeah.
I think the Nazi Empire, so there are conditions. That
true, 100%.
And that's one one of the things I worry about is like the conditions that could put pressures that we don't think about.
And there's gonna be a lot of problems. I mean, it's just like when capitalism emerged out of feudalism.
Yeah.
There was a lot of problems they didn't foresee, and it was very dirty and messy.
But I also think that was actually cool because you would see that there would be like the pushback against, like if the co-ops came up, there would be pushback from the capitalists, and then that would actually force them to be like, well, this is why we're better, or this is why we're worse.
Yeah.
Same with the feudalism.
Well, and as much as I agree with you in that point you made earlier about like banks not necessarily like trying to keep down the little guy, however, there are specifically with cooperative banks. The big banks has actually pushed through legislation to try and make it much more difficult for cooperative banks to get a foothold, but that's a direct competitor, so that makes more sense.
Be curious, what is the difference between a cooperative bank and a credit union? Is there?
I think credit union is a type.
Okay, yeah.
I
They're all
do.
pretty prolific. Depends on what part of the country you're in.
Well, I think there's something that stops them from getting to like. I don't know the actual
most of them
legislation.
actually limit their own growth on purpose because they don't want to turn into these giant.
The big
banks.
fucking
so,
for sure.
Right, and it's nice because you actually a lot of times get better interest rates and stuff.
The credit unions are the shit.
Do you see also?
I divested from Bank of America to go to a credit union during the whole Dakota Access Pipeline thing.
Nice.
So that was cool.
Just the fact that is a thing that's been shown to happen, that moral imperative taking over like an economic imperative, where they're literally just like, I'm gonna put a cap on my growth. Like, when have you heard that from like a capitalistic, like straight capitalistic company? Just banks.
So there's a couple other benefits I hadn't mentioned yet. So part of the study showed that they analyzed how these democratic cooperatives responded to the economic crashes. And it was really interesting because what they did was almost across the board, rather than firing people, they all collectively agreed to lower their wages as a whole and to kind of like weather it, making a smaller income until the crisis was over. They put all the emphasis on keeping their jobs, even if it wasn't paying much. And then as soon as the economy got better, they increased the wages again. So it showed it had more versatility in terms of weathering stuff like that, because they think as a community. It's not a business that sees its workers as human capital.
Right.
So there's this kind of like core incentive thing where current capitalist businesses, their primary thing, one at the top, is profit. And workers are seen in some ways as very much as one of the main liabilities to profit, even though they generate it, because they're one of the huge costs. So a lot of capitalist institutions are trying to lay off workers to save costs, to automate, to get rid of the workers if they can. Whereas in a democratic cooperative, the jobs are number one. And profit would be a slightly lower incentive, which is a necessary incentive to keep the jobs, but it would never supplant the job as the core motive, which I think is a much healthier model, because it's a system that serves the people in it,
I agree
primarily.
with that. I think one of the big issues with it is that, how we mentioned earlier, the AI issue. Just thinking
Yeah.
about that, it's like, jobs. We're basing all this around the idea of jobs, but those are about to all be gone in the next 50 years.
Well, but check this out. Another weird question that could happen
I
in a
thought about
co-op.
this too.
In a co-op would be, do we want to make everything AI?
Well, the issue with that, though, is
They
that
could say
you
no
have
to
to
that.
do that in a wholly democratic co-op system then. And because if one company does, then they're
Then
going to
they're gonna
Well,
compete you.
unless my idea would be, so Mondragon also, or easier one to think about is Google. It's like Google has how many things they do for their employees? Like they have multiple different types of food you can get, where they're classified differently depending on health and shit like that. They have masseuses, they have restrooms, they have all of these different types of things that if you look at it, you're like, wait a minute, that's just I think every human should probably have that, and they would be happy if we all did that kind of organization. And then you get to see that, and that's how I kind of view universities should be run the same way as Google, and we kind of got to that point the other night. But it's the idea would be that you have it doesn't matter now all of what's happening on the outside, if there's a bunch of companies that are running by AI, because your system works so well with the people who are with you that it'll work as its own government. It'll be like its own economy, unless you literally then get people who are physically fucking with you, and then now you
this
have
this
war,
is an
right?
interesting question. So if you're a part of a democratic cooperative, what do you think you're going to decide to do if the potential to automate most of your work comes about? I think a lot of them would probably decide to have these robots do most of the work, and just not have your pay change, and you just get more time off. Like I think it'd be a lot more leisure time in a world where the AI is in the hands of democratic workplaces.
I feel like it's Dwight's point though, of like if everybody did that, that'd be awesome. But
but in a world, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously now we're starting to get into utopian because this is a lot of variables.
Right.
But my ideal world would be one where AI is doing all the menial labor in the world, and the only businesses that exist are ones for human service and enrichment, and they're all run democratically by their workers.
Yeah.
If that's purely utopian, but we're talking on a very theoretical level.
Be nice.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really good segue.
I'll move there.
A really good segue into one of the other things that we want to talk about. We got about a half an hour left, so we can really get into this a little bit. Is that like the idea of universal basic income and the effect of AI in the future, and what sorts of economic models and government models can work in that type of society. And so I would pose to the group, let's start with what do you guys think about UBI, like just in general?
Yeah, I have a few different thoughts on this. I think Elon Musk made a really good point about, so there's the risk of de-incentivizing people to go get a job if you have universal basic income, especially if you'll lose it if you start making X amount of money.
Definitely.
So Musk's idea was never have anyone lose it. No matter how much you get, you still get your basic income. So that's just kind of the floor. And then people are going to decide how much they want to better their lives, and they'll know there's no other variable.
I think
that's a really good idea.
I agree. I mean, to call it universal basic income and then have it be lost in some cases is kind of a misnomer, I would say.
I think that's pretty stupid. There's ideas about it replacing essentially the whole rest of the welfare state. I think that's an interesting idea. Makes me a little nervous.
Have you heard Yang's idea for that? So what he wants to do, if he got elected, could implement it, would be to try to replace the welfare state sort of slowly as an opt-in model. So essentially you could keep whatever benefits you have now, or you can just take the $1,000.
That's
check.
better.
Yeah.
That's good. I don't like the idea of getting rid of it entirely because it scares me.
Yeah, there's too many people dependent on it to just have a system.
Yeah, again, that kind of idea of that quick turnover.
But I definitely think it's a good idea, like to try and incentivize people to switch.
Yeah.
So that over the course of a decade or more, we're starting to get to the point where we could eliminate it feasibly without too much shock.
I think universal income is a good idea. I still center my views on democratic cooperatives, even in a world where there is universal income, because from my perspective, one of the central problems in society is the concentration of wealth and power, specifically power. And so another ancillary benefit of this democratic cooperative model is it really is a political attack on the control that wealth has on the political system. The more of the economy that can be inhabited by democratic cooperatives, the less of that wealth will have a monopoly on its ability to buy the government. If democratic cooperatives are buying the government to do things, because the government's just corrupt still, but it's taking money from democratic cooperatives, I think that's much more likely to serve the interests of the people than, these Goliath hierarchical institutions. Obviously, I'd like money to get out of politics entirely, but I think it's an improvement in terms of it serving the people.
People will try to serve their own interests. So that's like what we have with
the
partisan issue right now.
Yeah.
Like if
even businesses,
if a Christian co-op got control, they might decide vote to lobby the government for.
Or an oil co-op might still do shit about climate change.
Try to deny climate change.
Don't get me
wrong. We really need more CO2. Guys, check this out.
And that's why I'm saying that this is not a utopian idea.
Yeah.
There's real issues that still exist that are connected to the issues we face now. I just think it's a massive improvement. But I really do think that authoritarian hierarchical structure of society is the thing we need to get rid of, because I think in a post-AI world, you're going to have China or something like China, which is going to take this full authoritarian. And I think the only way to counterweight that, to create still a sanctuary in the global civilization that is based on individual liberty and freedom and democratic interaction with one another, is going to be if we create that like now, like before that kind of authoritarian arms race starts. Because I think America is starting to go, well, I'm afraid I'm losing my top at the heap of the hill. and so I'm going to start doing that scary authoritarian shit because I'm afraid of losing top dog status. I'm really worried we're going in an authoritarian direction. And I think radical democratization of our institutions may become increasingly necessary to guard against this kind of post-AI dystopia that is at least manifesting in what is going to become the most powerful country on the planet.
Yeah, that is scary for sure. What do you have to say about that, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty, I think that's true. I don't know, like, the idea that any more democracy in our country would be bad, I think that anyone would disagree with that. Like, if we could find any
There are
places
people
where
who
we
would,
can...
but-
But I mean, okay, yeah, well, against authoritarianism, how about that? Like, any more democracy...
Everyone would agree except the authoritarians.
Right.
Yeah, right. So...
In which case, if your argument is, I want to be one of the oligarchs, I say, go fuck yourself.
Totally. So, I mean, I think it does come down to group dynamics, and at least, like, it would be, like, in democratic co-ops, it would at least infuse the idea of group dynamics, because I feel like that's another really big, like, psychological issue that we have nowadays, is, like, a lot of people feel like an individual who's trying to get as much as they can from the system that's trying to fuck them.
Certainly in America.
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly. And I guess that's what I'm
Yeah.
mostly talking about. So the idea that there is also this place where you have to do, there's like not profit isn't the number one thing, you know, the number at the end isn't the number one thing. You can still have that human interaction and that, like, that compassion that can come just from, maybe you're not like an Einstein, but people will still keep you around because you make them laugh every once in a while, and maybe that actually does help you work more. You know, maybe that doesn't have a dollar value in the profit, but maybe it just makes you feel better as a person, and you don't have to do as much healthcare or stuff like that. I feel like there's a lot of psychological values that are not incorporated into our economic system, and I feel like this could probably help.
Hopefully,
with that.
yeah. I think it'd be an improvement for sure.
And
But
I think one of the
still a
biggest
lot of
the biggest things in authoritarian governments seem to me as they try to objectify every psychological thing. You know, so it's like the basic premise is that everyone's an object in an authoritarian.
yeah, I mean, it's
government.
called human capital in economics.
Right.
You know, that's dehumanizing in and of itself.
So
Totally.
yeah.
Oh, what was I gonna say? Anyway, I'll think of it again.
I was also wondering what you had to say about UBI.
Oh, the universal. Well, yeah. For me, that I think it seems obvious, even if you're just looking at the, like, structure of what it takes to be a human being, like, on this planet. I think it's really important that for some reason, like, that we take into consideration that if we have the values that people, like, deserve to be living on this planet, like, if they're alive, they were brought into this world, and, like, they deserve to at least be living, then I feel like that's necessary there needs to be at least, like, some resources given to those people, if not an income for them to acquire those resources. And so I think that for us to really be, like, unless someone obviously commits a crime that makes it way more that's like, you could get into whether you think about capital punishment and stuff like that, like, at least you can talk about a criminal, but, like, to say that there's a person that comes into this world who doesn't have enough resources to live, or to live, like, a life that we know would probably make them into a better person, that we haven't, like, just admitted that and somehow incorporated that into our system in a very, like, substantial way. I think that's irresponsible, and I think that's
I
just
agree.
like...
Yeah, it brings up the thing that Jordan Peterson talks about when he talks about IQ, is that the Army, it's illegal to induct anyone into the Army that has an IQ of less than 83, which is about 10% of the population. And so we're assuming he equates that to basically saying if the Army can't find a job for you, then there's probably no job in society for you. Or there's at least very few, which means that 10% of the population basically cannot be used for anything as far as the economy is concerned.
Exactly.
And
So then it's a matter of our morals. Does that mean we take care
Exactly.
of the vulnerable, or does
Exactly.
that mean we
Right.
sacrifice them?
And the interesting thing that AI brings to the table when we're talking about this is that IQ of 83 is only going to grow.
Yeah.
Like, it's only going to go up and up and up until, the IQ of 145 is barely enough to get you a job, and that's genius level right now. So it's like...
Well, I wonder if that's going to be relative, because
Let's hope
Well,
that
but
our
maybe
intelligence
not,
increases.
because
too.
maybe it's like, your intelligence increases. Because
too.
maybe it's like, your intelligence needs to be so high in relation to the other people you're interacting with, so that scale is just going to keep going up.
Yeah, it
Like
might
maybe a 145 IQ is going to be just a worthless soldier in a world where the average soldier is a 250. So,
knows?
who knows?
Yeah.
But the other thing I was going to say is, aside from universal basic income, because I think there's nothing to stop universal basic income from existing in dystopian China. So I don't think it addresses the problem of authoritarianism that is on the rise, which is why I'm still focused on democratic cooperatives, because I'm trying to answer that question. How do we keep a free society? But another thing, just like as an idea of a business that might be good to transition to the democratic model, think of news, think of journalism, think of the media. Imagine a publicly funded but internally democratically run media. I mean, it's just fascinating to think about the possibilities there, especially within a culture where you have that strong democratic citizenry with that education. You know what I mean?
If the public was funding it, wouldn't you be behooving to the government and their ideals? Because they're not going to allow you to essentially do anything you want.
See, that's an interesting question, because, how do you fund something so that it can do its work without thinking about profit, without having it beholden to the source of that income?
I really like the Patreon model for stuff like that.
Crowdsourcing, absolutely.
Crowdsourcing, have you heard of Patreon?
Yeah, no, I subscribe to a couple things, like Democracy at Work. I pay them $5 a month.
Yeah, I really like that model for that. I don't think it scales.
Well, what about I don't know. I think that's a good model if there's enough support there. But I like the idea of it being something that's like an embedded right, as opposed to something that's only available if we can crowdsource it. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what about something that's like, because we have a constitutional right to a free press.
Right, but the problem is usually when the government is involved, that's what's the definition of it not being a free press.
That's true. Although I would say, publicly funded media like, PBS, I think is better than corporate media.
Largely,
it's not like
corporate
really media,
news,
it's free media.
The reason PBS is good is because they don't cover news.
It's just like informational education. Yeah. It's
well,
tough. This is a tough one, but we need a free democratic media.
If there's a so I think one of the biggest problems with that, having a government-funded media outlet, is the setup. Because if you were to set it up in such a way that their funding could not be cut or something like that, it was really hard to manipulate.
Yeah, constitutional.
Kind of like how judges are set up to try to avoid any influence from government, interests, right? So some way that we can sort of kind of try to wall them off from any sort of government backlash from something they might say. Yeah. It does. I like the idea, because right now what we
the funding would have to be somehow in stone.
Put it in mandatory spending. You couldn't have a discretion.
Exactly, because the fact that we have media beholden to profits right now is one of the things that allows it to run away with models of inflammatory news and sensationalistic news, and if you had a company that wasn't worried about making more money, it was just trying hopefully trying to just present
just
news.
Run on their principles and their and
Ideally,
the people who get into it would just be like, I'm making enough money to make a living, but the reason I'm doing this is because I'm a patriotic democratic citizen.
Hopefully that would be what would happen. Exactly. And that the interesting thing is, right, if you set this up with an idea that you're trying to remove negative incentives, you could also unintentionally remove positive ones too. So it'd be interesting to see what would actually happen, and what the incentives of the people that went there could be, and how you could try to set it up in a way that was somehow trying to be more objective and trying to be more fair to everyone. But I think that it definitely has some potential, and a lot more potential to be less corrupt than what we have now.
It's just the other problem though with corruption, when you don't have a profit incentive, is then it becomes an incentive for corrupt people to seek that out. Because if I wanted to instill communism or fascism into the